It's been an extraordinary 24 hours in British politics when Liz Truss walked out the doors of Number 10 and announced her resignation. She became the country's shortest serving Prime Minister.
I came into office at a time of great economic and international instability. Families and businesses were worried about how to pay their bills. Putin's illegal war in Ukraine threatens the security of our whole continent, and our country has been held back for too long by low economic growth. I was elected by the Conservative Party with a mandate to change this. We delivered on energy bills and on cutting national insurance. And we set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party. This morning I met the chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady. We've agreed that there will be a leadership election to be completed within the next week. This will ensure that we remain on a path to deliver our fiscal plans and maintain our country's economic stability and national security. I will remain as Prime Minister until a successor has been chosen. Thank you.
Now, her leadership had been under intense pressure. In the last 24 hours, there had been a chaotic confidence vote in the House of Commons. Just hours before that, she had lost her Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, and that came after weeks of fallout and pressure from her mini-budget. Now, the mini-budget she announced with her then-Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, included billions of pounds of unfunded tax cuts. Now, that sent the market into free fall and also prompted an unprecedented response from the UK's central bank. It turned out Liz Truss could not recover from that damage, and eventually she faced pressure from her party to stand down. When she emerged from these doors, she said she no longer had the mandate to lead. So what happens now? Well, the Tory party is trying to find a new leader, and they say that they should have one in place within a week. Now, by Monday, we'll understand who those candidates are. Some names that we expect to come forward is Rishi Sunak. He was the runner-up to Liz Truss in those leadership elections when Boris Johnson was ousted, and also the House of Commons leader, Penny Mordaunt. She came third in those leadership elections. Now, we'll know on Monday, but the candidates who get through will need to have 100 MPs backing them. Now, there is one very controversial name that's being thrown around to take over the top job, and that is Boris Johnson himself, who was ousted from Number 10 back in July. Now, there are grassroots members, but also a number of Tory MPs who say he is the only person in the party who has the mandate of the public to lead. Now, many say it's unlikely that he'll be able to get that 100 votes to progress in the leadership elections, which we then understand that Conservative Party members will also have a vote in, but it would be an extraordinary turn of events. Whoever is elected, they will become the third British Prime Minister to serve in just this year alone.
And Tim Bale is Professor of Politics at the Queen Mary University of London. He says the roots of the turmoil engulfing the Conservative Party in Britain can be traced back decades.
You would have to trace it back, actually, to the growth of anti-Europeanism in the Conservative Party from the 1990s onwards. And then, obviously, you would say that was exacerbated, accelerated by the move towards Brexit and indeed the Brexit vote itself. And ever since 2016, when we voted to leave the European Union, I think you could say the Conservative Party has become ever more destabilised and more volatile.
How can you trace it back that far?
Well, I think that was the point at which the Conservative Party lost its moorings in some way as a rather more pragmatic centrist party. Although people often associate a more radical neoliberal vision with Margaret Thatcher, she was actually a more canny and cautious politician than many remember. But I think the bitterness caused by her departure and the lack of enthusiasm spilling into hostility on the part of many Conservative MPs over the years towards Europe, I think made the party a much more ideological outfit than it ever used to be. And therefore the factionalism within the party that was, always latent but never particularly manifest, I think really grew and moved us really into the era, we are in today, where, the Conservative Party, as I say, is a pretty ideological outfit and therefore, I think, slightly less easy to govern.
So you say there's this trend towards radical right-wing populism. Do you expect that will be reflected in who wins this ballot over the next week, or there'll be some pushback against that?
Well, I think there may be some pushback against that, because I think the recipe during the Boris Johnson years actually was a more populist form of conservatism. There was a lot of talk about, the war on woke, culture wars, very hard line on immigration, very hard line on Europe, a quite nationalistic tone in many ways. I think many Conservative MPs now are wanting to dial that down a little bit, partly because what they're looking for now is less a populist than someone who is just basically competent. And they haven't really found that in their last three leaders. They've picked three duds, if you like. Theresa May back in 2016 was no kind of communicator and a really poor campaigner and quite a difficult character, generally speaking. Boris Johnson, great campaigner, absolutely no idea how to run a premiership. And then Liz Truss, deeply ideological and also a very, very poor communicator. So they really are looking for someone who has, if you like, a more conventional skill set that you expect from a prime minister, somebody who's got a basic competence, basic intelligence, both emotional and obviously intellectual, and someone who's a good communicator.
So you don't expect Boris Johnson will be a contender?
Well, he might be a contender, and certainly in his own mind, I'm sure he is a contender. He felt as if he'd been stabbed in the back and, run out of Downing Street unfairly by some of his critics. He, I think, has always thought about a rerun, although not perhaps quite as quickly as this. He was on holiday, in fact, when Liz Truss announced, despite the fact that Parliament's sitting, which I don't think will go down too well with some of his critics. But I think that Conservative MPs will probably be realistic enough to realise that he's not the solution to their problems. After all, when he left office, not 2 months ago really, he was one of the most unpopular prime ministers we've ever seen. 2/3 of people wanted him to resign. So if the Conservatives think that he is the answer, I think they're living in a fantasy land. But that's not to say, of course, that some Conservatives aren't living in a fantasy land.
Do you expect the Conservatives will be forced to an early election?
No, I would be very surprised if that would happen, simply because they are so far behind the opposition Labour Party now in the opinion polls that we would be talking about a wipeout, a meltdown, whatever word you want to use. I think what they will probably do, which they can do constitutionally, because we don't need to hold an election, actually to January 2025, believe it or not, they'll want to hang on as long as possible and just hope something will turn up. But sometimes it does. We might be able to remember back to 1990 when John Major took over from Margaret Thatcher. The Conservative Party was very, very unpopular then. We were in a recession. Nobody expected the Conservatives to be able to win. And yet John Major won another majority just 2 years later in 1992.
And how is Labor positioned now then?
Well, Labour is in a really good place at the moment. Its leader, I think, has sorted the party out internally. He's not particularly inspiring, but as you in Australia know, you don't necessarily need to have an incredibly charismatic personality if the incumbent party is unpopular. He's seen as I think now, safe pair of hands, sensible, competent, and in some ways, given the chaos of the last few weeks, that's exactly what voters are looking for right now.